And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Peters. He is the Professor of Assessment and Research Methodology at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, where he teaches courses on educational assessment, research methods, and gifted and talented education. His research work focuses on assessment and data use, gifted and talented student identification, equity within advanced learning opportunities, and educational policy. And he is here tonight to talk to us about the 10 essential rules for defensible gifted education. So without further ado, Dr. Peters, take it away.
Thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me out to Colorado, I guess it is. So I'm going to be talking about this topic of defensible gifted education today. And my goal is to not spend too much time talking about it, to try to maybe spend about 30 minutes getting through it. And then have time for discussion or questions. I want to give a little explanation of this topic. I've been asked a lot over the last couple of years, especially by people who are really focused on equity, doing good work on equity, about giving them resources for how to talk about gifted education to really equity concerned audiences. So when they're doing equity audits or when they're talking to a superintendent that has questions about gifted education, increasingly, I've been asked by groups, how should they do that? Or how do I do that? And so a lot of what I've tried to do with this session today is to talk about defensible and kind of indefensible gifted education practices and ways to then talk about gifted education to explain why it is appropriate or defensible. So it's kind of an odd topic because I'm approaching it from the standpoint of what are some principles that, if followed, make gifted education practices defensible. And down here at the bottom, I've got the QR code. You can snap that with your phone and that will take you to this slide deck. The nice part about that is there's several things that are linked in this slide deck in terms of news articles or resources. And so if you want to be able to grab those, you can just snap that QR code and you'll be able to get to these slides. And if I just keep talking long enough, then people will have a chance to snap that QR code. The trick is to keep going on and on in case anybody wants to do that. Okay, I'm out of time. Also at that website right there, that's my faculty website, and there's a whole bunch of free resources on there. So there's nothing on there that I'm going to make money off of. I just post everything I do, versions of those articles and everything all goes to my faculty website. So if any of this stuff is interesting to you or you're just looking for stuff that I've written, you can find it all at that website for free. So without further ado, let's get into the principles. The first thing we have to talk about is, what makes skip a slide. What makes something defensible? What makes a practice or a service defensible? So the first thing that makes a service defensible is that it's got a clear benefit that's easy to explain. So if you've got a gifted education program or a gifted education service, so you've got many, many services, just think about one of them. It's defensible if it's got a clear benefit. The better you can document the benefit, the better. And it has to be easy to explain. And so something where you have a benefit, but it's very it's vague or it's long-term, that just becomes harder to defend because it's not as simple, to just communicate to a general audience. It also needs to have kind of a widely accepted goal. So even if something you don't have a specific benefit, you haven't done a study to find out that it's got a benefit, it has to at least address a widely accepted goal. And I bring that up because not everybody will agree with a goal that you have for a particular service. People have a really wide range of priorities and goals. Not all of us agree. So we want to make sure that we can defend and define our services along the lines of widely held goals. That's going to get you the most kind of stakeholders on your side. And then the last one, which I think sometimes we forget about, is that the service has to be implemented or provided in the least obtrusive or least objectionable or least separated way as possible. And so what I mean by that is we're not having kids do a pull-out program if we can get the same benefits in a non-pull-out program. Or we're not going to regroup students and have a standalone gifted magnet if we can get those same benefits in a less obtrusive way. And I'm saying all of these from kind of the standpoint of, again, defensibility or getting people on your side. I'm not saying that, gifted ed's inherently indefensible. This is just thinking about ways to frame these conversations so that it is, you do have more people on your side. So these are kind of the general principles. So let's get going. So the first one is clearly articulated needs and benefits. And I don't know how many of you, pay attention to the news like I do, in terms of gifted education, but I have a news alert that I get every day for every news story that's published about gifted education. And if you've been paying attention in the last couple of years, more and more places are cutting gifted services. So there's a district outside Minneapolis that just straight up deleted its services in the name of equity. Getting rid of them made them more equitable, apparently. Charlottesville, Virginia, 83% of the kids in Charlottesville, Virginia are identified as gifted. So basically the entire population. I basically call that getting rid of gifted ed because it's just a label that doesn't mean anything anymore. My home district of Madison, Wisconsin has gotten rid of high school honors classes. There's been a lot of discussion about getting rid of honors math classes or algebra before ninth grade. It's been in the news about New York City getting rid of its program. And one of the gifted programs, one of the things to think about is that why are districts so quick to cut, GT? If you talk to anyone who's been around GT for a while, these programs are under a lot more fire and criticism than something like 8th grade algebra or advanced placement or international baccalaureate. And why is that? And my argument is that a lot of these other programs, while they are inequitable, you look at AP enrollment. AP enrollment is not equitable in terms of by socioeconomic status or race, but it's still around because it has that demonstrable benefit. People see why it matters. It's prepping kids for college or something like that. You go back to gifted ed, and too often we aren't being clear enough about what are the benefits of these services. It's just this kind of vague thing that we know Mrs. Johnson does on Tuesdays at Washington Elementary, but it's not clear enough. This is the need that it's meant to meet, and this is the benefit that it provides. If we were clearer about that, we wouldn't be open to this criticism as much. And I'm making really big generalities right now because maybe you never in your life have had this kind of problem in your district, and that's a great thing. But more and more, I'm seeing these articles come across. And I think one of the challenges is it's not meeting these criteria that we mentioned before. We aren't documenting that clear benefit. And especially it's number 3, to a lot of outsiders, when you go to talk to people that have no connection to gifted ed and you talk about gifted ed, they see it as segregation. They see it as a way to segregate learning environments so that some kids don't have to school with those other kids. I think most of us involved in gifted ed would push back on that, but that attitude still exists. So we need to make sure that we're providing these services in the least segregated, least objectionable way possible, because that way we aren't open to as much of the criticism. Again, I'm not agreeing with any of these arguments. I'm just saying these are arguments that have come up quite a bit in my work kind of all across the country. The second one is the simplest. It's this would, could, should rule, which is a rule from Harry Passow from a long, long time ago. And it is, would other students benefit from this service? Could other students do this? Or should other students do this? So pick your gifted ed service, whether it's compacted math, creative problem solving, whatever it is. If the answer to any of those questions is yes, then we shouldn't be restricting it just to, quote, gifted kids. So if you've got a gifted program that involves lots of really fun field trips, you should ask yourself, would other kids want to do that? Probably. Should other kids do that? Well, if it's like going to the museum or something, then yeah, other kids should probably do that. And could other students benefit from that? Yeah. So make sure that if you're restricting access to a service, it's done because other kids wouldn't benefit from it, couldn't benefit from it, or it wouldn't want to do it, or shouldn't do it. So that's where something, again, like AP or early algebra or something like that meets those criteria. Not everyone would be able to do algebra in 7th grade. So that's probably one of my clearest rules in terms of service. Not mine, it's Harry Passow's. But if you have a service that doesn't meet those rules, then you really need to open up that service to a broader population, even to the point of if everyone would benefit from a gifted activity, we shouldn't be restricting it just to gifted kids. Doing so makes it seem like we're restricting it unnecessarily. So that's probably one of my favorite golden rules in the field. Rule number 3 is that we should be offering services that really extend or accelerate learning. Like that's really what gifted services should be for. We've got these kids that are under challenge, they need more challenge. So we respond by providing services that extend their learning or accelerate it. And what does that look like? Well, it looks like whatever it would take to make sure our most advanced kids were challenged. So people ask me all the time, what is gifted curriculum? What are gifted services? And my answer is always the same. I have no idea, because it depends on what advanced learning needs are going unmet in the students right here, right now. So we need to figure out who are those kids that need something more, who are under challenged in their current learning experience, then we need to provide them with additional supplementary learning experiences that extend their knowledge. And just to give you a quick example of this, I worked in a district that had so many kids in 10th grade that were finishing Calc BC as 10th graders that they had to actually offer college level calculus on site to 11th graders. So several years advanced, just a normal class. What it would take for those kids to be under challenged, it would take a really advanced kid to be now under challenged in that context in terms of math. Like we're talking a kid who's like already doing college level math, 10th grade. It would take a lot for that kid to be under challenged because there's already so much being offered. In other contexts where that's not available, we might need something like AP Calculus. So we really need to think about the local context, and good gifted services are those that alleviate an unmet learning need. They take a kid from a situation of mismatch, they are mismatched with their learning, and now match them. Now they are appropriately challenged, zone of proximal development, soup's not too hot or too cold, all that kind of stuff. That's really what a gifted program or a gifted service should really be doing. And this is why I point this out, is because this is the typical 5th grade classroom nationwide. So about a third of 5th grade students nationwide are at 3rd grade standards or below. About a third are meeting 4th grade standards. About 24% are already meeting 5th grade standards, like on the first day of school. Then you've got all these super high kids up here. You got about 2% of kids nationwide in 5th grade who are already scoring proficient according to 9th grade standards. These are very diverse kids in terms of their learning needs. This is a very challenging environment to teach, to challenge all these kids. That's why we need to have advanced learning services to kick in when this is not enough. When the grade level classroom, teaching these 5th grade standards here is not enough for these kids up here. That's very defensible. That's an argument that is unobjectionable. Why does this kid need gifted services in 5th grade? Because she's already mastered 8th grade content. That's not something a lot of people are going to argue with. But too often, just to go back, the services we offer don't extend or accelerate learning. They're kind of wonderful, interesting activities, but often ones that would benefit lots of other kids. So you've got a kid who's maybe scoring at the 8th grade level in math in 5th grade, but she's getting a 30-minute a week creative problem solving activity. Nothing wrong at all with creative problem solving, but that's not alleviating her unmet need. It's not extending her learning in the area of her identified talent. I think that's a place where gifted really gets tripped up, and it becomes hard to defend, oh, Susie's getting creative problem solving, not because she's interested in creative problem solving or has an unmet need, but because she's advanced in math. I mean, that's hard to wrap my head around how that logic works. That's really what I'm getting at here. Number 4, the social emotional risks, the inherent risk of gifted kids for social emotional problems is an inappropriate basis for services. And this might come across as kind of controversial. So let me be clear what I mean. We do not have evidence in the empirical literature that gifted kids are at an inherently higher risk for health or mental health problems. Okay. They are also at no less risk. So the world of gifted kids out here, this world of gifted kids that exists somewhere, is not at a heightened risk for depression, self-harming behaviors, asthma, allergies, any of that kind of stuff. But they're also at no less risk. They're about the same. I think one of the challenges is that people that are not in gifted ed think that gifted kids should be at less risk, so that when any gifted kid has a problem, it really stands out because they've got the wrong prior in their head. So maybe the risk of, depression is like, 1 in 4 or something like that. Everyone thinks that because a kid is gifted, it should be like 1 in 10, like no gifted kid should ever have depression. Well, most of the research tells us that the prevalency rates are about the same. But the reason I bring this up is because I've seen districts try to have gifted programs on the basis of these unique social and emotional challenges that gifted kids have. And while they absolutely do have them, there are gifted kids that have these challenges. Do not mistake me. The population of gifted kids in the world is not at a heightened risk. And this is kind of an important nuance. It's not that they're at less risk. They're the same risk as everybody else. But because they're the same risk as everybody else, we shouldn't be providing services just to them and not everybody else. And this is one that people often have a lot of questions about, and I'm happy to talk about it. But even kids that are grade accelerated don't show a worse social emotional development. And that's a really extreme intervention. So I really don't support this idea that we need to have special programs just for these gifted kids because, they're so challenged, that they are like people that have been exposed to trauma or something like that. I really don't think that's a safe assumption to make. Number 5 is about identification. So identification needs to be aligned with services. And so, for example, I've seen too many districts that identify in language arts, and then the program is creative problem solving. Or I've seen kids denied participation in Lego League because their language arts test scores weren't high enough. Not really defensible. What if my kid loves Lego League? What if my kid would play with Legos for hours if you let her? But I kid you not, I have a colleague whose kid was not allowed to be in Lego League because her language arts scores were only in the 97th percentile. That is not defensible. Identification and services must be aligned. So if you have a service that focuses on math, you should be identifying based on mastery of prerequisite skills in math. And not even just math, like what's the kind of math? Is this numeracy? Is it geometry? Is it measurement? We should be trying to align as closely as possible. A big change in gifted ed over the last 20 years has been a focus on domain-specific talent and domain-specific identification. So we should identify talent in domains instead of just global talent. And we should serve kids in domains instead of like globally gifted kids. There are still globally gifted kids out there. Those kids, it's not that they don't exist. It's just that there are a lot more talents in specific areas than there are for people that are just savants or Renaissance men or women that are, that are good at everything. And a study found that, this is a study I've linked to here, found that a lot of districts are identifying in math and ELA, like that's their most common identification process, but the most common service is critical thinking, like critical thinking programs. There's nothing wrong with critical thinking programs, but these things are not aligned. Providing critical thinking to an advanced math kid is not going to alleviate his unmet need in math. Similarly, there's lots of kids out there in the ether who would love to do critical thinking, should do critical thinking, or would be able to do critical thinking activities, but are not going to be placed in that service by a math or ELA test or process. So we need to make sure that the skills, dispositions, and abilities we are measuring in our identification process are the same kinds of skills, dispositions, and abilities that are going to be fostered in the service. We don't have you run a 40-yard dash to get into college. Similarly, we don't have you like shoot hoops to see if you can play ice hockey. We want our assessment process and our services to be well aligned. That's a really important one. I feel like I say that for everything. Number 6 is a little weird because it's pretty straightforward. It's not as much a principle, but it is that acceleration is drastically underutilized. Academic acceleration has the strongest research base of any gifted education tool or toolbox or service. And yet we use it far too rarely. Schools should really be proactively screening kids for acceleration. And actually, if you're interested in that, we have a grant right now that's happening this year and next year where we're helping schools more proactively screen kids for acceleration. So not only does acceleration benefit the accelerated kids, but if you think about that 5th grade classroom again, and you send that kid who's basically at the high school level now on to 6th grade, that 5th grade teacher can now actually do her job, which is to teach 5th grade content and teach 5th grade students. So it's kind of helping the kids that are in that classroom and also helping the kid who went on to a more appropriate learning environment. And just to give you some examples here, if you're an educator, these are all very commonly used practices, using concept mapping, having teacher PD, direct instruction, bilingual, mindfulness programs, reducing class sizes. Those are all different levers that schools can push to increase student learning. Every single one of those has a smaller effect on student learning than grade acceleration. So reducing class size is peanuts compared to grade acceleration. Doing mindfulness or having bilingual ed programs is about half as effective at increasing student achievement as acceleration. So it's low cost because there's no special gifted teacher we have to have. You have to facilitate the process, certainly, but there's no separate class or anything. So it meets one of those defensibility criteria I mentioned because there's no separate gifted room. And it's hugely effective in terms of increasing achievement, all while having no negative side effects on social emotional on average. Of course, it can still go badly, but on average, there's no social emotional negative effects. So I think schools should be using acceleration a whole lot more. It's very defensible in terms of the research literature, has huge effects. So depending on what your audience cares about, there's something to love for just about everybody in terms of acceleration. So I'm a big great acceleration proponent. Number 7 is kind of related to number 5, but it's just another way of thinking about it really, which is think of identification as program placement. People get the idea of measuring prerequisite skills for a service. That's not terribly objectionable. If someone says, why isn't my kid in AP physics? And you say, well, because she hasn't mastered the math to do the class, no one's really going to argue with that. But if you say, oh, your kid can't be in the gifted program because her language arts scores were only at the 96th percentile and 97th, not the 97th, that's where there's going to be some arguments. And maybe some of you have those arguments. So we should think about the program that we have, or a service, any given service that we're offering, and think about what are all the skills and abilities necessary to do well in that program. And, algebra is kind of a great example. How should we decide which kids go into algebra? Well, we should probably see which ones have mastered pre-algebra. How should we decide who should skip from the end of 3rd to the beginning of 5th grade? Well, we should probably see if they've mastered the 4th grade level content. Like, this is just a much cleaner and more defensible criteria for program placement. We send students to college if they demonstrated they've mastered prerequisite skills to a certain level, at least enough to succeed within some probability. So thinking about identification less as identifying the gifted as like this permanent trait of some humans, and more about program placement is just a little bit more logical. I find it much easier to explain. And for that reason, it's a lot more defensible. Number 8 is also an identification one, kind of on a totally different wavelength, really. This one's really kind of for the K-12 folks, not as relevant for the parents. But as a general rule, there's a pretty straightforward relationship between the percentage of kids that you consider for gifted services and the percentage that you miss. So if you universally consider everyone, so imagine you've got an identification process. If you put every single 2nd grader through that process, 100%, you will always miss the fewest kids. Always, always, always. But it's very inefficient. It's very expensive. On the other end of the continuum, test no one, then you'll miss everyone. So we got our 2 extremes. Miss the fewest if you test everyone, miss everyone, but you save a lot of money on the other side of the equation. But there is a pretty straightforward relationship between the large number of kids you consider, the fewer that you'll miss. What you should take away from that is get rid of like referral-based systems where you're not considered unless you're referred, because the result is you're considering very few kids, just a couple percentage of kids. And instead, do something like have 2-phase systems with a fairly low barrier to access. So instead of relying on referrals to determine who you should consider, maybe test anyone that's in the top quarter of something like your MAP test or your state test or something, because you're considering a large number of kids. Again, just following this rule that the larger percentage of kids you consider, the fewer you will miss, and the ones who you no longer miss via something like a universal consideration system will be disproportionately your underrepresented kids, economically disadvantaged kids. The more you screen, the lower you set that threshold, the fewer of those kids you'll miss. So it's both an effectiveness issue and an equity issue. We're missing fewer gifted kids in general, and the benefits are going to go disproportionately to our underrepresented kids. So a very kind of defensible practice. Number 9, school services should use school norms. This means local norms. I know a lot of people in Colorado know about local norms. So if your goal of your particular gifted service at the building level is to challenge the most advanced kids in the building, then you should use building norms. Now, maybe you're a really big district and you've got district-wide services. I was just working with a district outside Minneapolis that has a district-wide advanced math program. That's fine. Maybe use different norms for that. The norms should match the level of the service. And if you have a service, maybe her name's Jan, she's 0.5 FTE in a particular building, then her goal is to really challenge the most advanced kids in that building. Like, she has no interest in what the kids in Denver are doing or Aurora are doing. It doesn't matter. She works here. She wants to identify the most advanced kids in this building and then try to help challenge them more. Because of that, you should be using building norms. And we could talk about how that works in Colorado with portability and everything else. But building norms just means you're identifying the most advanced kids in the building, as opposed to the kids who are most advanced compared to some kind of national framework. So instead of looking at the 95th percentile nationally, you're looking at the 95th percentile among the third graders at this building. It's both more defensible from a kind of conceptual rationale framework, and it's a lot more equitable. Building norms have been shown to have, depends on the district, have a really powerful effect on the diversity of the population of students identified as gifted. So two pretty big positives, more kind of conceptually coherent, it makes more sense, and you get a lot more equity out of it is a pretty big win-win. And then finally, number 10, I don't like to save this for last because it's so important, but we need to really be much more proactive about equity in gifted education. Designing what we might think of as neutral identification systems will never result in anything close to proportionality because we don't live in like a neutral society. A lot of our low-income kids, a lot of our Black and brown kids have had fewer learning opportunities. They've experienced discrimination. They've had a lot of things happen to them that have impeded their learning. And we have to do things to help develop those talents before we start doing identification. So a defensible gifted ed service or gifted ed department or gifted ed offering, however you want to think about it, is one that does two things. It challenges these kids who are already advanced, often because they've had a lot of privileges, but it is also doing things to try to develop talents in kids who haven't had those opportunities. It's really like a two-pronged approach. So we might offer an advanced service in third grade, but in K2, we also offer talent development services to try to help get those kids ready. And there's a lot of great examples of that. I mean, Elgin U46 outside of Chicago is probably one of the best. There's a programs called Young Scholars that try to do that, or primary talent development is kind of a proper noun that does that. So all kind of along the lines of taking kids who haven't had the opportunities and trying to help them develop those so that come identification time, they are identified at higher rates. And that absent that kind of proactive effort with an eye towards equity, it becomes really hard to just defend having nothing but the challenging kids who are already advanced. So that was 10 things in 30 minutes. And if you know me, I can talk for forever. So that I got through that very quickly. I want to leave you with two things. One, again, is that website at the top. I swear I don't make money off of this. It's just the website that has all the resources about identification, all my book chapters and articles and things like that. There's a little app on there for doing a ton of information about how to do local norms, a bunch of information about identification on there. If it's helpful, feel free. It's all on there. I also have 3 different books. These two on the left here and in the middle kind of talk about this approach to gifted education, about meeting unmet needs and everything. So if that strikes your fancy, this is kind of the OG book here, Beyond Gifted Ed, and then Designing Gifted Ed Services is meant to be a little bit more practical, I guess, but they're both pretty similar in that regard. And then Excellence Gaps in Education is more of a policy book, really about how we close advanced performance gaps. So if any of this stuff sounds interesting to you, these are the places to go for it. And with that, I think I'm exactly halfway through. So I'm happy to have any discussion or answer questions that might be helpful.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions that did come in. And so the first one was kind of earlier on in the conversation. Mark Elliott had put in, how might Gardner's 9 types of intelligence factor into this conversation?
It's a good question, and I'm gonna take it in kind of a certain direction, but Mark can chime in and yell at me if I'm taking it in the wrong direction. I will accept that. I like to I argue that gifted education is kind of domain agnostic. And what I mean by that is there will always be talents in far more areas than K-12 schools have the ability to serve. And I'm very focused on K-12. I'm not focused on kids who are gifted. I mean, some of my earliest work was actually on gifted in CTE areas. So like gifted welders, that was really interesting. But I'm not focused on like gifted in, I don't know, pottery or something like that. Definitely people that are gifted in that area, but I'm focused on the K-12 context. And what I say is that the domains that we serve in gifted programs in K-12 schools, I actually talk about this in Beyond Gifted Ed, should follow this kind of 3-step philosophy. The first is philosophical. So what do we value? What's important? And that's why we have things like math, like science, because someone has decided these are philosophical values. There is no 11th commandment that says, thou shalt teach social studies. That's just someone decided that that was a philosophical value. math is important, these kinds of things. PE, good, these are all just values. So the first thing we have to decide is, what do we value enough that we want to devote additional resources to it? So are we going to have a gifted program in math? Are we going to provide accelerated services in the arts, whatever? That's number one. Then we go cultural. So do we serve a particular group of students that have particular interests in certain areas that we're going to offer services that somebody else might not? And I don't know Colorado well enough to give you examples. I'd probably end up embarrassing myself. But if I think about Wisconsin for a second, where I live, there are schools in rural Wisconsin that legitimately have like 4-H agriculture related gifted programs because that's their culture. Like that's what they value. And it's important to that community, but might not be important at all to Waukesha or South Beloit or Milwaukee. It's just not of interest. It's not part of their culture. So I think in addition to saying, okay, we're going to have gifted programs in math or creative problem solving or whatever, that's philosophy. Cultural says, who are our kids? What do our communities value? Even to the point of saying, I've done some of my colleagues have done some work on the Navajo Nation, and they basically have gifted programs like kind of related to the arts, like to making textiles that are incredible because it's a cultural value. So I think that's the second criteria. Then we have the practical criteria, which is the simplest one, which is, look, not every primary school is going to have a violin gifted program, because it's just not practical. We can't serve every single talent. We can try to have things like mentorships that facilitate a wider range of services, but we're not going to be able to offer a program for every single talent. So the reason that the MI question made me think of this is, and I come from Indiana, where there was actually a school designed around multiple intelligences. So I've got kind of some experience in this area. But the reason I bring this up is that too often people think that gifted is creative problem solving or critical thinking, but it's not. The domain is separate. We have to decide in what domain or in what area we're going to offer additional services or resources. And then the goal is to identify kids who would benefit from them. That it's always a bit of chicken and the egg. It's kind of cyclical. But I don't like the idea that gifted programs are always seen as inherently about math or inherently about reading or even just academic areas. I think the domain or the content area can and should vary depending on the beliefs, the values, and the culture of local communities. And I guess I'll stop there.
No, I love that. I love the idea of taking it from the criteria, from the philosophy to the cultural to the practical. It's a really good way to think about it. So we have 2 other questions that have come in, and both of them are focused around acceleration. So I think your whole using the effect size of acceleration of a 0.7 spoke to the crowd, so to speak. So the 2 questions, I'm just going to kind of give them both to you, and I'm happy to repeat them, but one might impact the other and how you want to explain it. So one was, what is the most current and compelling evidence to support acceleration? And then the second one was, how do we get a district to accelerate?
Both great questions. So in 2016, there was an article in, was it, as soon as I said it, now I forgot it. Was it Review of Educational Research or Ed Researcher? Hang on, because I have it right here and I'm happy to share it with anyone who is interested. So it was a 2000 article. The author's name is somewhat long, actually a colleague of mine from grad school, Steenbergen, who is her last name. It was Review of Educational Research, so RER is what we call it for short. And the article is titled, What 100 Years of Research Says About the Effects of Ability Grouping and Acceleration. So it's a double whammy for folks. It talks about ability grouping and acceleration. And it's what we call a second order meta-analysis. So it is a synthesis of syntheses of acceleration research. So it's the definitive source. It is without question, the definitive research on acceleration. And that is the paper that talks about the different effect sizes from the different types of acceleration and different types of grouping and everything. But if you want a research source, that is the primary source. Now you can also go to, if I go back up to my slides here, you can also go back to, this is from Hattie from Visible Learning. And I know a lot of teachers know about Hattie. He also talks about, I think he says like 0.69 or something. He also talks about it in there. So this is not just something where it's only the academic source. The article also talks about how they looked at social emotional effects. That's where I said earlier, there's no negative social emotional effects. So the article I mentioned also talks about that. So that's what I would say is the most up-to-date research on acceleration. How do you get districts to buy on? I like to argue it kind of what I've already said to some degree. So one is when I have people that come to me and say, look, I got no budget and there's not going to be any pull-out classes or anything. So what do I do for advanced learners? I say the same thing every time. I say you should be using some kind of clustering and you should be proactively grade accelerating. The reason being is that they have no cost, essentially. Cluster grouping is just rearranging kids. It's not like we have no special section adding teachers or anything. Same with grade acceleration. There's no additional staff. And acceleration has such a huge effect. So big learning gains and essentially zero cost. Like the cost is someone to facilitate the decision-making process. And just as a side plug, the grant that we're working on is figuring out how you can universally screen kids for acceleration using existing data you already have. Because I think that's one of the big barriers to acceleration is we have things that are called the Iowa Acceleration Scale or the Integrated Acceleration System is the new electronic version. You can just Google Integrated Acceleration System that tell us how to decide if Susie should be accelerated. What we don't have is anything that tells us when we should ever even think about Susie in the first place. And the problem there is then we rely on parent referrals or teacher referrals, which are very rare and biased and all kinds of problems. No offense to teachers, they're just not great data sources for telling us who to be accelerated.
Well, so I think just to interrupt, right?
Yeah,
I mean, for teachers and the administrators, because like I'm with you and I hear that they're not trained on how to do it. So we can't hold them responsible if they don't even know ultimately what to look for because gifted education's absence from teacher and administrator prep programs.
Yep. Yeah. This is not a dig against teachers at all. This is just, if a system that relies on a referral to initiate the consideration of a kid for acceleration is going to have a huge number of false negatives. That means a ton of kids who would have actually been accelerated had they gone through the process were never put through the process. So what some of my colleagues and I are doing at the National Research Center for Gifted Education is trying to figure out, okay, how do you look at your existing data, achievement tests, if you have CAGT tests or something like that, to decide which kids are kind of, it's the wrong word, but worth considering, like which kids are high enough that they should go forward because it's acceleration. So it's going to be pretty high. But that idea of a universal screening process so that we don't have to rely on referrals. So I think in terms of how do you get people to do it, it's to talk about achievement benefits, which are pretty well established. It's to emphasize that do accelerated kids start to have perfectionism problems? Sure. Is it systematic in the research? No. The kids in terms of social emotional development do just as well. So talking about how there's, we're not turning kids crazy by accelerating him, that those kids are fine. And talking about its low cost and about how it's taking some of our neediest kids and kind of accelerating them to allow the GT teachers or the classroom teachers to then focus on everything else. I think those are fairly compelling. It's never going to get past the, my nephew's sister's uncle once heard of a guy, who burned down a building after being accelerated. It's hard to fight back against that kind of stuff, but I think that's pretty much the best argument you can give it.
Yeah. And I would add in, the using Hattie's work because Hattie is so mainstream at this point that people understand that. And for the person who asked that question, I think from an administrative perspective, what we do have control over is time, money, and people within our building. And so that if we can use research that people understand to help impact our decisions around those three things, then maybe you'll find yourself in a little bit better of a spot.
I also find talking about this is helpful. So if you're a teacher and administrator and you can show your staff, like, hey, everybody, did you know we actually do, it depends on the data you have, but do you know we actually have a third grader who is scoring proficient in 7th grade math right now, and you can show them on their data, it becomes less abstract. And a lot of times you'll have that teacher that says, oh yeah, I know Phil. Like, yeah, he teaches me new things. It's very clear this kid is advanced. In the abstract, it seems like we're going to harm, some kid. When you start talking about real kids and people are like, oh yeah, I'll be honest, I haven't taught that kid anything new in math in all year, because again, these kids are such outliers. So sometimes presenting an actual school's data can also really help so that it's not so abstract. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we have a question that thoughts on how to mesh your studies with public school district budgets. For example, if there's already isn't a budget for new services, how do we do this at all local schools versus the gifted magnet school versus the economy of the gifted magnet school?
So I'm going to answer this question, presuming that, there's a district already out there and the district has like some, let's say there's 3 GT staff for the entire district or whatever. So there is some kind of GT staff. And now the question is, we're not going to get more staff or more money. So we have to, how do we make that money and that FTE go as far as possible? And I don't have it in my slides, but I have this kind of diamond model of RTI or of MTSS. It's in pretty much every one of those books. I'm sure it's in there somewhere. It's also on my website. There's a couple chapters of it. I want to think about how to challenge the largest number of kids possible with my existing resources. And that's why I'm going back to grouping and acceleration again, because if I am doing something where I'm clustering my regular grade level classrooms, that is increasing the reach of like my quote grade level instruction. So if not every teacher is teaching to that entire range of kids, and instead I'm clustering so that they're targeting a little bit better, now I have a wider range and a larger percentage of my kids that are being kind of challenged in their zone of proximal development. So right away, one of the first things I would do is take some of that FTE of my GT folks and devote it towards facilitating clustering, because that's where, a fifth of Mrs. Johnson's FTE at Washington Elementary can facilitate a lot of kids being challenged now. It's a big bang for your buck. But then we're not done, because that's not going to challenge everybody. Then Mrs. Johnson is also going to devote some of her time to doing proactive subject and grade acceleration, because those are the fewest kids, but they have the most extreme needs. So maybe now I've taken up 0.5 of Mrs. Johnson's FTE. I just spent half of her soul on clustering and on acceleration. And now in some ways, the hardest kids are our tier 2 kids. So those are the kids that are too advanced really just for like in-class differentiation, but not advanced enough to be like grade accelerated. And that's sometimes where like the RTI intervention periods or win time or push in, or that's often the most FTE or staff intensive services. That's then where the rest of that time gets used. And again, sometimes that can be pulling kids during win time, what I need time, the most advanced kids. Sometimes it can be pushing in and working with the most advanced cluster in a classroom. It can look a lot of different ways. But when places are saying, okay, we have a really limited FTE and or money, I say, okay, let's try to challenge as many kids as possible using things that don't take FTE or money, the clustering, the grade acceleration, also mentoring, by the way, which again is like matchmaking. It's facilitation rather than service delivery. Do as much of that as you can, because it goes a long way per unit of Mrs. Johnson's soul. And then we can talk about, okay, with what's left, how much kind of actual direct service delivery can happen. And that's going to vary a lot by building, vary a lot based on the schools. But when I'm being asked, how do I do gifted ed on a budget? That's kind of where I start. That's what, I sound like I'm hawking these books, but that's a lot of what we talk about in here is like, how do you decide who can be challenged in the cluster grouping, who can be challenged in acceleration, like so that every single kid in your 3rd grade has a home. They've got an instructional placement somehow that's going to challenge them at their level. That's always the goal that we're shooting for.
And the last question that we have for right now, unless another one comes through, is looking into the local norms. So I know we talked a little bit that guidance around local norms is changing, becoming a little clearer in Colorado, and the ability to use them. So any suggestions that you have for those educators in Colorado who are kind of stepping into that space, suggestions on how to use local norms, how to use them kind of within that interplay of national norms, any advice that you can give our CAGT members for that?
Yeah, so I just share my screen real quick because I'm going to go again to my website here to show you some resources, first of all. So there's my website, there's my smiling face on there. And if you click on gift identification resources here at the top, then down here at the bottom, you're going to see resources for implementing local norms. And there's a couple things on here, and then I'm going to dive into the question. So the first one is there's an article on here. This is a Gifted Child Today article that a couple of my colleagues and I wrote, and we sat down and said, what is the manual? Like, what is the step-by-step FAQs, everything you need to know in one place? That's what we wrote this article for. Half of it is, the rationale, what is it, and like screenshots from some various spreadsheets to walk you through local norms and everything. There's example districts. And then half of it, I think, getting to your question, is frequently asked questions. So our responses to many of the most common questions that we're getting. So even if after this conversation, this is really my go-to place for answers, that kind of thing. Also on here is a spreadsheet to help you do local norms, literally to physically do it in a spreadsheet, and an instructional video that you can listen to me talk for 13 minutes and 55 seconds about, there you go. You can, if you haven't listened to me talk enough, you can see me talk through exactly what that looks like. Okay. So there, I've shown you that. Even if, let's pretend for a minute that tomorrow Colorado decides, you know what, we're really not so keen on the local norms thing. We're going to go ahead and outlaw them quietly while no one's paying attention. I don't think that's going to happen, but let's just pretend that something like that happens, or you're in a state that is really strict and doesn't allow them at all. Well, and there are states like that. Those states have definitions of what gifted is according to the state definition, to meet state rules for portability, for funding, for submitting numbers to the state. They want to know how many kids meet these criteria. They don't get to say what you do for any other services. So I've worked with a number of districts that are in these really strict states where gifted is only allowed to be X, that have also started a different kind of service called Y. They call it talent development. They call it tier 2. They call it whatever they want, and they can do whatever they want because it is outside the definition of gifted for the state. Now, I don't think you all in Colorado are in that extreme of a situation, but just remember that no matter how the state comes out with its guidelines, is that the term, guidelines? Guidance, you can always do things kind of above and beyond. Like a talent development program is never really going to meet the definition of gifted. That doesn't mean you can't have it. You just kind of need to go out of bounds a little bit and think a little more creatively. Now, how local norms within the Colorado guidance is going to depend on the final guidance. But when I've worked with some Colorado schools in the past, one of the things they really emphasize is, you can kind of sort of use local norms if it will result in greater access. Doesn't guarantee portability, which again, in my mind is actually fine, because just because you are in the top 10% of this building and therefore need more challenge right now, does not mean when you move schools, you also need more challenge. Maybe that school is fine. Maybe that school is right where you are and you don't need services anyway. So I actually don't have any problem with the portability thing. And some kids are going to be identified regardless of where they move. Some kids are only going to be identified at one building, but not the other. I think that's fine because it's all about meeting local unmet need. So the biggest thing I would say is that you can always make building norms work regardless of the state definitions. And you can also have kind of parallel identification tracks. This is something when I was fortunate enough to do some work with Aurora a couple of years ago. And they really had kind of a parallel identification track where anyone was identified at any building if they met the national norm. But then they also had some target buildings, some of their lowest income, most diverse buildings where kids were most underrepresented, where they also used local norms as like a supplement. So thinking about, it's not that we're not using national norms, it's that we're also looking for kids with those local norms. So if it sounds like it requires some tap dancing sometimes, or some creative interpretation of the rules, that maybe that's what I am saying, but I think it's definitely doable.
Hey, we're educators. We're good at that.
Yeah, I mean, come on, right?
Goes with the territory. Okay, exactly. One final question, but before I ask it, because we did have one more come through, can you please put your presentation back up with the QR code on the very first slide? And while you're doing that, look at you so fast.
Can you see it?
Yes, I can. Final question of the night. Can your next research question include acceleration on 2E kids as well? They don't always perform well on the tests that weren't normed for them. And sometimes, ultimately, I'm just adding on to this, right? Sometimes when you're using that Iowa acceleration scale, then that, whatever makes them that 2E can deflate that score. And so depending on who's helping you or your guidance through that and what they know, then it can definitely paint a different picture.
I think that's very true. It's also another reason why I talked about two-phase identification earlier. If phase 2 for acceleration is like actually, passing the integrated acceleration system and getting recommended, phase 1 with that referral is always going to be too high, quote high, for like your 2E kids, because teachers are going to be looking for the 99.9th percentile kid who's good in all areas and all that. So it's why in our research study, the screening criteria at phase 1, the screening criteria is a lot lower. So it's only, I forget what it is off the top of my head, but it's not looking for like amazing, it's like top 10% instead of like 99th percent or something. And in part, that's for those, kind of underrepresented kids who maybe are doing really well, given their opportunity, given a disability or whatever. We're just not seeing it otherwise. It is always difficult. I actually asked a similar question of some colleagues who did an acceleration study and said, can you disaggregate results by like race or ethnicity to see how it works for kids of different backgrounds? And the thing that they wrote back was, there's so few kids of color who are economically disadvantaged who are accelerated that we can't even look at. And I imagine it'd be the same for 2E kids. Like right now, they're so rarely accelerated, it's hard to know if it works for them, which is depressing, of course, but it also makes them just a hard population to research. I'll leave you with one point, which is anyone who's interested in 2E. So the only federal funding for gifted education is called the Javits grants, the federal Javits program. About a week ago, the RFP, the request for proposals, was released. So it just came out. It's right here at my desk. And it is very focused on 2E. So if you are a BOCES, if you are a school district, you can apply for these to do projects to improve the identification of 2E students, to improve the services for 2E students. I know of districts. It's not just me at the university that gets them. Districts can apply for these, or you can reach out to a university and collaborate. So there has never been a better time to like get some money from the feds in terms of doing projects for 2E. So if that strikes your interest, by all means, take a look at that.
Definitely, absolutely a great place to research. So with that, we are going to go ahead and we are going to say good night to everybody. And next week we have got on Conversations with CAGT, Diane Hecox, and she will be talking on underachievement or underlearning. But thank you so much for everyone for coming tonight, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Take care. Bye-bye.